with a quote by the late, great Toni Morrison. You know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for the houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods in these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact it is not flooding. It is remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. Writers are like that, remembering where we were, what valley we ran through, what the banks were like, the light that was there, and the route back to our original place. It is emotional memory. What the nerves and the skin remember as well as how it appeared. And a rush of our imagination is our flooding. It's from Toni Morrison in the Site of Memory. The site was Johns Hopkins Emergency, the Sidney Kimmel Center Radiology. The site was East Baltimore, what we call the Valley, Berea neighborhood. The site was Prince George's Hospital. The site was the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital. The site was Piscataway Country. The site was Opportunity, a good job. The site was Dreadful, from which Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, for example, and many others fled. The site was Montgomery, Alabama. The site was Greensburg, Pennsylvania, Central Park, Manhattan. The site was Queens, New York, Columbia, Tuskegee, Los Angeles, Jackson, New Orleans, Detroit, occupied Palestine, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Ocean, and on, which is to say that the memory has infinite eyes, has many sights, and thus its geography is unbounded. That's what Toni Morrison's concept of rememory tells us, that there's a way to remember a place you've never been because the site has had to exist for you to be here. So when I suggest that there are ghosts in the clinic, I'm acknowledging that there are many lines of sight by which one could appear here. The atrocities and triumphs which took place in order for the clinic to be built, stolen land, stolen labor, those who have passed through before, those who made medical advancement possible, the lessons gleaned from them that tell us who we are, the patient who comes in, another series of sites, the prison, the plantation, the suburbs, occupied land, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic. What I mean is this. Picture the patient. The patient first, because why not? The patient is a black woman, mid-20s. She's had one child and is married. She comes to the hospital complaining of severe abdominal pain. The doctors decide it's an appendicitis. She leaves the hospital without an appendix, without pain. She and her husband tried for years for a second child. When she's of old age, in the final stages of her life, her only daughter finds out through medical examination that she had a hysterectomy. She asks her mother about it. Her mother knew nothing about having a hysterectomy. To think of all those years she tried for another child and could not figure out how to conceive. I'm concerned with the mother, but here's where I trip. My concerns are also about the daughter. How does she go to her daughter, to her doctor after this? What would she ask herself if she has all the organs that she thinks she has? What of her daughter? What of the family that could have been larger? How do we hold spaces for the ghosts of children never born because they could not be conceived? I trip again. What about this doctor? Their colleagues? Do they continue to practice this kind of sterilization? What are of the younger doctors and residents who are old now and retired? What did they learn? What did they teach? Not of the practice, but who can be subject to one kind of procedure over another? Who has the right to consent and who does not? What constitutes consent? What did they unlearn? What of the nurses? I trip again. What about this hospital? How were these procedures documented, if at all? What were the conversations around the ethics of these procedures? What was understood as a greater good? And again, consent. My questions here. ask about the experience of the patient's children, the women who would come after her, the ongoing medical practice by the doctor who mutilated her, the structure that made the doctor's practices benign and sound, the hospital and its records, the supposed ethics board. I ask about the nurses and the other doctors, the legacy of the everydayness of that kind of mutilation, what hangs around in the hospital that still stands through this thing has happened. I ask about the desire of the unborn to live through the desire of the living, and by now, I've tripped over the patient, who, by this time, has found out that she was mutilated well over half a century ago at the very end of her life, whose memory is reaching for this thing that happened to her, is reaching for the version of herself that wondered what was wrong with her and lived anyway, whose chances for redress are highly unlikely and confounded by the statute of limitations that is death, distance, and time. What is left behind is the story, the daughter and her children, the hospital, and the doctors and nurses who worked with the doctors who did this thing, or who learned and trained under the doctors who learned and trained under those doctors who did this thing. I'm also thinking about the daughter and her children's next doctor, or rather everything that follows them when they come under medical care. Does the story of their grandmother, her mother, come in like a flood? When they ask the question of their doctor, do they phrase it just so, with the memory rehaunting? Do they, like me, pause and reflect on the question, how much does it hurt, on a scale from 1 to 10, with countless ghosts in the room? Do they demand their own records? How do the staff regard them and their awkward ways of engaging with them? How do the requests, how do the staff respond to their requests for many professional opinions? Do they avoid the doctor altogether? How is their health anyway? I tripped again. That woman in her 90s, no doubt had a long life, and she's died. What had been the quality of her life? Her health in those later years. What happened when she caught a bad cold? Went in for a routine mammogram? How could she go on her whole life not knowing an organ was absented from her body? How does she rest now with that flesh knowledge of her body? This story is one of the many stories that Black women have told me after reading poems from what is now my book, Patience. This is its website. After a presentation of this book in Prince George's County in February 2015, a Black woman, perhaps in her 50s and 60s, wanted me to know this story about her mother, to add my collection of such stories. When preparing notes for this presentation, this particular story came up for me because really all I wanted to do was read some poems and say a very simple thing. Who is in the exam room, the clinic, the NICU, the ICU, is not just staff, personnel, doctors, and patients. There are ghosts there. There are traumas that govern how one enters the doctor's office, the hospital. There are questions, issues of tone, issues of how tone is heard. There are echoes of the ghostly and forgotten, the institution's haunted past, the colonial fantasies for which it was built, the stolen land on which it was built that haunt the mechanisms of that institution. This haunting alters the ways that doctors, technicians, and nurses do the job they claim to do. I would like to urge any practitioners in the room to believe in ghosts. The problem is, those who probably should believe in ghosts probably don't believe in ghosts. Perhaps it is the job of social scientists to qualitatively and quantitatively confirm such hauntings exist in the form of unspoken practice, textbooks, to interrogate who is gifted with the opportunity to deny the existence of ghosts, who is able to be in the room at all. These researchers have and will name for us that which people are coddling as unconscious bias, They document and number the perhaps coincidental difference in pain management for patients according to race. They do and undo those numbers that qualify one group as at risk for their existence and difference rather than how that difference has shaped their existence. And perhaps it is the job of the writer, the creative writer, whose ears bend to all kinds of whispers, those of the living and dead, to believe for them. There are ghosts in the clinic. I know because I bring them with me any and every time I go, and I leave with more than I came with. And here's some poems about some of them. So this is multi-experiential. You have to participate in the reading of this first poem. Before I get into them, I do want to talk about a bit about the fact that I do still collect stories. Here under the Connect section, there's a space where people who would like to share their story with me. I usually actually just get them in person. I very rarely have gotten them over this mechanism, but I'm wanting to expand that. In addition to collecting these stories, there's also a resource build for folks such as those in this room, folks who are interested in the question of racial justice in medicine, and also for medical practitioners who understand this history, culturally competent, and creatively inclusive. So that ultimately there would be a space, a kind of repository where people can go. So, this first poem, you have to repeat this quote from my grad school advisor. History is also everybody talking at once. And so you have to say this phrase with me on beat. And it's not, I'm serious, on beat. And every time I say the word I. Okay? All right, so we're going to do a test run of this. In 2006, I had an ordeal with
everybody talking at once.
Do better.
It's
I.
History.
Okay. So let's do it like that. Let's practice like that. I.
History is also everybody talking at once.
I.
History is also everybody talking at once.
I.
History is also everybody
guilty
talking at
of
once.
something. I don't feel innocent here lurking with ghosts. See, it happens like that. I start at a thought that is quite benign and end up heckin' debased. I had an ordeal with medicine and was found innocent or guilty. It feels the same because I live in a haunted house. A house can be a dynasty, a bloodline, a body. There is punishment. Like the way a body is murdered by its own weight when lynched. Not that I was wrong, but that verdicts come in a bloodline. In 2006, I had an ordeal with medicine. To recover, I learned why ghosts come to me. The research question is, why am I?
History is also everybody talking at once.
Thank you. Inner truth. History is also everybody talking at once. When I open my mouth, there's another voice. I have to press one finger to my tragus to hear me. The other becomes louder, more rapid. There are many voices now, gaps, garbled underwater talk, some of it in another language, collected words, Peter, automaton, John Hopkins, string a line across my tongue. None of it is true, but all of it is true. Betsy invents the speculum. Fall, 1845. A quote from J. Marion Sims' The Story of My Life. Introducing the bent handle of the spoon, I saw everything as no man has ever seen before. I have bent in other ways to open the body, make space. More pliable than pewter, my skin may be less giving. Great discoveries are made on cushion lessened and hard falls. Sims invents the speculum. I invent the wincing, the if you must of it, the looking away, the here of discovery. Is there no sound?
It was like the baby was on mute.
Alright, what we'll do is I will play it and then read and narrate what's happening in the video. So this is a combination poem with two poems in the book that connect Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy to a woman named Joyce Heth. This is page 13 of one of J. Marion Sims' textbook, and the diagram is of a woman in Sims' position. The Calculus of Us, with an epigraph from J. Marion Sims' autobiography. I spent a month very pleasantly in New Orleans and got acquainted with my friend Mr. P.T. Barnum, who was then traveling with Jenny Lind and stopping in the same hotel with us. Dear Joyce, my fate and yours and arithmetic. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the function of slave equals canary, where canary means recurring death. If this is true, you too were experiment, your exposed brain to my contained urine. Of these things, we are both cured. The function of cure equals elimination, preservation. There is honey and never returning to fields, salt and 35 operations, your dissection, subjection. The function of subject equals conscious mind, ego. Autobiographical retraction, our ghosts, the stories, slippery abolitionist showman, coward, Confederate doctor. Square and compass, or Joyce posthumously reflects on the geometry of the showman's recollection. The epigraph from the life of P.T. Barnum written by himself. I was favorably struck with the appearance of the old woman. She was lying upon a high lounge in the middle of the room. Her lower extremities were drawn up with her knees elevated some 2 feet above the top of the lounge. 1. Square the right angle between one leg that cannot move and one that will not. Bisect with your horror. Proof, empty breasts, hungry mouths. 2. Diameter, the distance between Boston and Alabama. Proof, bill of sale. 3. Find the radius to Anarcha. Look legs first. Proof, showman is doctor. Doctor is showman. 4. tangent is history. The researcher contemplates Venus. When I talk about my work, I'm often asked to speak of Sarah Bartman. I take Sarki's hand and ask her, "Where would you like for me to put you?" She laughs, or maybe she sighs. Researchers only ask leading questions, questions that lean toward the body, sometimes trip over the dead. Thank you.
When the body holds.
I'm so sorry about the technical malfunction today. Thank you so much to Bettina. Do we have comments and questions for Bettina? Why don't I open it up with asking about, you were saying you're collecting stories?
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do with those stories, what you're doing with them?
I'm waiting to see what they tell me to do, in some ways. So when I collect them, I ask the person telling me the story, whether it's in person or in this online space, what are you okay with me doing? Are you okay with me telling the story? What would you like the story to do? And so this is one of those opportunities where I actually got to tell one of those stories. The stories have varied. I think the story that I told today is both, it's not unique, and it illustrates the point about the idea of ghosts in the room. All of them do, really. But in a way that we've had these conversations about Mississippi appendectomies in some circles. We've talked about the extent of forced sterilization in Black women. Some of the stories are much more subtle, and I'm still trying to figure out what to do with those stories. Because some of these stories, and I have some, they trigger me to think about my own stories. Some of the stories are as simple as, I went to the doctor to get a pap smear, and this is not my story. I'm saying it in the person who's telling me the story's voice, but I went to the doctor to get a pap smear and ended up crying because the person, the attending nurse was so, told me that I needed to better my sexual practices, that I was being too promiscuous, having not known anything about my actual sexual practices, right? They can be as subtle as, I kept telling the doctors that there's no way for me to be pregnant, and they decided I needed to take another pregnancy test because they couldn't imagine that a 23-year-old Black woman couldn't be pregnant. So these kinds of stories, I think, ask for a different kind of retelling. So I'm waiting for them. Yes.
Thank you. Amazing. I sit on both sides of this experience that you're talking about, both as a patient and a practitioner. And my research is about trying to uncover the data in the language of the funders to demonstrate how these stories create morbidity and mortality. A very simple one I have permission to tell is a woman whose first experience with a gynecologist was when she was 11 and had a longer than usual first period, and this gynecologist told her mother to put on birth sexually active because there was no context. She was then met with shame, and so when she was 62, started bleeding. She never went to gynecologist after that, so she bled for 3 years before she showed up for an appointment and was diagnosed with stage 4 endometrial cancer, which is easily curable in diagnosed early stages. So I feel like I live in this space, and I feel like I'm constantly thinking about ways in which to translate what you have presented beautifully into the words and the numbers and the figures that can allow me to radically restructure the practitioner side of where I sit. My question for you is, do you think that's possible? You opened with, we need to believe in more ghosts and things like that. So I'm just curious, as with the work, I'm struck by how you've chosen to do this intellectual work in this way. And so my question is part of that thinking that the data side of things is not going to tell the full story? I'm curious as to your thoughts of how this can potentially merge, or if it's possible. I hope that made sense.
No, it makes total sense, and I think about this all the time, right? Like the very kind of the feeling of being absurd, of feeling like I'm being absurd by asking people to believe in ghosts, makes me ask this question. Like I have to ask this question, and so I think a couple things. One, we believe in narratives all the time when they serve a particular kind of purpose. We believe in stories about quantifiable data that is spoken in a particular language that grantors and whoever can understand all the time. All the time. That's how, I'm not going to go there, but that's how a lot of things happen, right? This country, for example. And so, in that sense, I think it makes sense. Like it's possible for an individual, maybe even an institution, to understand the value of something because the story was told. At the same time, there has to be an investment in wanting to hear said story, right? And so, and another thing is, I think what I'm hearing at the core of your question is, can these stories be made into quantifiable data? And I'm not sure it can, right? I think about the work of Saidiya Hartman, for example, who kind of concedes in many ways this idea that what we understand as the archive, what we understand as data that can be repeated and collected and regurgitated in a particular kind of way is actually harmful. It always cites the point of injury, right? So even in the way that we would quantify this kind of data, it always can run the risk of pathologizing a group, right? In ways that might not be helpful. So I think we need to really challenge what we understand as knowledge, and really challenge how we talk about how we teach STEM, how we what we mean when we use the term data, in order for kind of a fuller picture to be shown. But I'm a poet. Like of course, like I have these thoughts, but I hope more and more people will find some use into it.
Thank you so much, Bettina.